Today is May 16th, 2026, and the New York Times just published a report that changes the entire conversation about what happens next in this conflict. The report cites two Middle Eastern officials confirming that the United States and Israel are preparing to possibly resume combat operations against Iran under a new operational name as early as next week. Another option would be to put special operations troops on the ground to go after the nuclear material buried deep underground. The units that train to do this are your Tier 1 units, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6. Both have capabilities to conduct this mission. Several hundred special operations forces arrived in the Middle East in March in a deployment specifically meant to give Trump that option. The diplomatic track has been running, the blockade has been running, the pressure has been building for weeks. And while all of that has been happening, Delta Force has been sitting in the Middle East since March, waiting for authorization. Today is May 16th, 2026, and the New York Times just published a report that changes the entire conversation about what happens next in this conflict. The report cites two Middle Eastern officials confirming that the United States and Israel are preparing to possibly resume combat operations against Iran under a new operational name as early as next week. Another option would be to put special operations troops on the ground to go after the nuclear material buried deep underground. The units that train to do this are your Tier 1 units, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6. Both have capabilities to conduct this mission. Several hundred special operations forces arrived in the Middle East in March in a deployment specifically meant to give Trump that option. The diplomatic track has been running, the blockade has been running, the pressure has been building for weeks. And while all of that has been happening, Delta Force has been sitting in the Middle East since March, waiting for authorization. The options on the table include more aggressive bombing runs at Iranian military and infrastructure targets and a special operations ground mission specifically aimed at Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile at Isfahan. The report confirms that several hundred special operations forces arrived in the Middle East in March in a deployment explicitly described as being intended to give Trump that option. But here is what the Times report does not fully articulate and what you need to understand. The ground mission option would require not just the Tier 1 operators conducting the nuclear material recovery itself. It would require thousands of support troops to establish and hold the security perimeter that allows the Tier 1 operators to work without being overwhelmed by Iranian military forces responding to the incursion. That perimeter force would likely be drawn from the 82nd Airborne Division, Marine Corps units, and Air Force Special Operations elements that have been accumulating in the region throughout the conflict's duration. The combined force, Tier 1 operators conducting the nuclear material recovery inside a security perimeter held by thousands of support troops, is an operation whose scale and complexity is categorically different from any commando raid this conflict has previously produced. It is not a hostage rescue. It is not a leadership elimination. It is the physical seizure of weapons-grade nuclear material from inside a sovereign nation's territory while holding off that nation's military response long enough to complete the recovery and extract. Military officials acknowledging there is a big chance of casualties is the understatement of the year. This is not a low-risk operation. This is the option that Trump has when every other option has been insufficient to produce the result that makes the Iran problem durable rather than temporary. Now, let's talk about what Delta Force's WMD recovery mission set actually is, and why it is the specific capability that the Isfahan nuclear material operation requires. Delta Force, formerly the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, is the United States Army's primary Tier 1 direct action and special reconnaissance unit. Its capabilities extend well beyond the hostage rescue and high-value target elimination missions that most public discussion of Delta focuses on. Among its most specialized and least discussed mission sets is the CWMD function, Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction, which includes the ability to locate, secure, and recover weapons-grade nuclear, biological, and chemical materials from hostile environments. This mission set was developed during the Cold War as a contingency capability for scenarios where Soviet nuclear weapons might fall into the wrong hands during a period of political instability. It has been maintained, trained, and expanded across the decades since the Cold War ended, as the WMD proliferation threat evolved from Soviet-era state-on-state scenarios to the rogue state and terrorist WMD acquisition scenarios that define the current threat environment. Delta Force operators trained for the CWMD mission are certified in radiation detection, material characterization, and safe handling procedures for highly enriched uranium and plutonium in their various physical and chemical forms. They train with the specialized containment equipment, the radiation protective gear, and the material handling procedures that allow them to assess, secure, and prepare nuclear material for extraction without exposing themselves or their fellow operators to lethal radiation doses. They practice the coordination with Air Force Special Operations elements that would provide the airlift to move the secured material out of the target area. And they train the perimeter security coordination with conventional force units that would allow them to conduct the recovery operation inside a defended space, while the conventional force holds the security perimeter against the Iranian military response. This mission set has never been used in a live nuclear material recovery operation, but it has been trained for decades specifically because the scenario of a hostile state's nuclear material requiring physical seizure was never removed from the contingency planning portfolio, even when it appeared unlikely. The Isfahan scenario is that contingency. Now, the material in question. Iran has acknowledged possessing approximately 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. That is not weapons grade yet. 90% enrichment is considered weapons grade, but 60% is what is called a breakout threshold. Once you have reached 60%, the remaining enrichment to 90% takes only a fraction of the time and energy that the journey from natural uranium to 60% required. The IAEA has warned repeatedly that Iran has enough 60% enriched uranium to produce multiple nuclear devices if the material is further enriched. That 440 kilograms is the prize. That is what Delta Force would be sent to recover. That is the material whose removal Iran itself acknowledged requires equipment that only China or the United States possesses. That acknowledgement is not a diplomatic concession. It is a technical admission. The Iranians cannot remove this material themselves without specialized equipment they do not have. So if it is going to leave the country, either China does it, the United States does it via diplomatic transfer, or the United States does it via Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 under fire in Isfahan. Now let's get into exactly what the Isfahan nuclear site represents as a physical target, because understanding the facility's location, its architecture, and the specific material it contains is essential for understanding why the ground operation option is being considered and what achieving it would require. Isfahan is located in central Iran, approximately 340 kilometers south of Tehran. The uranium conversion facility at Isfahan is the installation where Iran converts uranium ore concentrate into the uranium hexafluoride gas that feeds into the centrifuge cascades at Natanz and Fordo that produce enriched uranium. It is also the location where various forms of enriched uranium and uranium compounds are stored in different processing stages. The 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% that Iran has acknowledged possessing is at least partially associated with facilities in this complex of installations that constitutes the Isfahan nuclear industrial zone. The facility is not buried in the same way that Fordow's enrichment cascades are buried under hundreds of meters of rock. It operates primarily in surface and near-surface structures that are hardened against conventional air attack, but that ground access would not need to penetrate in the way that bunker-buster bombs must. The B-2 Spirit, delivering GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, can destroy what is underground. But destroying what is underground also destroys the material that is underground, and potentially disperses radioactive contamination across a significant area. The ground operation option exists specifically because destroying the material is the less desirable outcome compared to recovering it. Recovered material is verified, accounted for, no longer threatening material. Destroyed and dispersed material is an environmental hazard, an international controversy, and potentially a precedent for exactly the kind of dirty bomb risk that makes radiological terrorism one of the most consequential threats in the modern security environment. Delta Force going in to recover the material is the option that produces the cleanest outcome if it succeeds. It is also the option with the most significant personnel risk if the Iranian military response reaches the perimeter before the recovery and extraction are complete. The New York Times reporting that such an operation would need thousands of support troops is not journalistic hyperbole. It is the operational reality. The Isfahan nuclear complex sits in a populated area with Iranian military installations within relatively short response times. An Iranian military response to a ground incursion at Isfahan would involve a combination of IRGC regional forces, Iranian army conventional units, local law enforcement elements, and whatever armed irregular forces the IRGC's mobilization infrastructure could produce in the time frame between the operation's initiation and its completion. The security perimeter that prevents those forces from reaching the Tier 1 operators conducting the recovery needs to be large enough to maintain standoff at ranges that allow the inner element to work without direct fire interference, resilient enough to hold against the vehicle-borne and infantry attacks that Iranian forces would likely employ in a counterattack, and supported by the air cover that degrades Iranian military response capability before and during the perimeter hold. That requires the 82nd Airborne's rapid deployment capability to establish the initial perimeter force, Marine Corps units for the heavier defensive elements, Air Force Special Operations for the close air support and the logistics that sustain the force during the operation, and the full air architecture of F-16CJ Wild Weasels, F-35s and AC-130Js that provides the overhead suppression that keeps Iranian reinforcements from reaching the perimeter before the extraction is complete. Thousands of troops is not an overestimate. It is the minimum force structure that makes the Tier 1 inner elements mission achievable rather than suicidal. Now, let's talk about what Iranian state television's broadcast of AK-47 instruction videos to the civilian population reveals about how seriously the Iranian regime is taking the possibility of this ground operation. Because this is the most psychologically revealing single action the IRGC has taken in the entire conflict. Iranian state television, the information management apparatus that the regime controls completely and uses with complete deliberateness to shape its population's beliefs and behaviors, broadcast videos instructing civilians on how to operate an AK-47, how to use the safety, how to rack the bolt, the operational mechanics of a weapon that the Iranian regime does not permit its general population to possess, because it fears the population would use those weapons against the government. Read the multiple layers of irony and fear embedded in that single action. Simultaneously, a government that prohibits civilian gun ownership because it fears armed civilian resistance is now publicly instructing civilians in weapons operation because it fears a foreign military incursion and believes it needs an armed civilian population to resist that incursion. A government that killed thousands of protesters with firearms during the January 2026 uprising is now broadcasting firearms instruction to the same population whose protests it suppressed with those firearms. A government that controls its population through information management and selective weapons access is publicly acknowledging through its broadcast choices that the threat it currently faces is severe enough to override its standard domestic security posture regarding civilian weapons access. This is not a military threat broadcast designed to deter the American military. American soldiers are not going to watch Iranian state television and reconsider a Delta Force operation because civilians have been shown how to use AK-47s. This is a regime performing fear for its own population in the hope that the performance produces the loyalty and the resistance commitment that the regime's economic destruction of its own population has been eroding. It is also the clearest possible signal that the IRGC's internal threat assessment of what comes next has crossed the threshold from fear of additional bombing to fear of something operationally more intimate and more existentially threatening to the regime's physical control of its territory. Now, let's talk about Monica Witt. Because the FBI's announcement of a $200,000 reward for her capture and the manhunt that announcement signals are directly connected to the operational picture surrounding the Isfahan nuclear material recovery option in ways that the coverage of the reward announcement has not fully explained. Monica Witt is a former United States Air Force counterintelligence officer who had access to some of the most sensitive intelligence programs related to American intelligence collection operations inside Iran. She defected to Iran and provided the Iranian intelligence services with classified information about the specific programs the United States was running to collect intelligence on Iran's nuclear program, its IRGC leadership, and its proxy network management. The damage assessment of what WIP provided to Iran includes the exposure of human intelligence sources inside Iran, putting those individuals and their families at direct risk of identification and elimination by IRGC counterintelligence. It includes the compromise of collection methods that allowed American intelligence services to monitor Iranian nuclear program activities, the very program whose current status and physical material locations the Delta Force recovery option depends on current and accurate intelligence to execute. And it includes the exposure of program architectures that allowed the IRGC to understand where American intelligence collection had penetrated its organizational structure, enabling the IRGC to harden those penetrated areas and maintain counterintelligence operations against the remaining collection capability. The $200,000 reward announcement at this specific moment, when a Delta Force ground operation to recover Iranian nuclear material is being reported as under active consideration, is the intelligence community's acknowledgement that WIT's information about American collection capabilities inside Iran remains operationally relevant to the specific mission planning that the Isfahan option requires. The more complete the American intelligence picture of the Isfahan site's current layout, its security architecture, its material storage locations, and its defensive force disposition, the better the chances of a successful recovery. The more of that collection capability WIT compromised, the more the intelligence picture that the Delta Force mission would depend on is degraded by her betrayal. Hunting WIT is not just accountability for past crimes, it is intelligence damage management for an operation that may be weeks away. Now, let's get into the Russian evacuation flights. Because this behavioral indicator is the most operationally significant non-American signal in the current picture, and its connection to the pre-war pattern makes it impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Russian flights from Somalia to the UAE, moving Russian nationals out of the Emirates before anticipated hostilities. This is the same pattern that appeared before the war began on February 28th. Before Operation Epic Fury's opening night, Russian evacuation flights from Africa were running around the clock, moving Russian nationals and Russian military advisory personnel out of the countries where the anticipated conflict spillover effects would create risk. The resumption of that pattern, specifically Russian flights from Somalia to the UAE, moving Russian nationals in a context where the UAE has been confirmed as a third combatant in the conflict through its Lavon refinery strike, is Moscow's behavioral acknowledgement that its assessment of the situation has crossed the threshold where evacuation of vulnerable nationals is the appropriate precautionary measure. Russia does not run evacuation flights based on vague geopolitical concern. It runs them when its intelligence services have assessed that specific kinetic events are probable within a specific time frame, and that the risk to Russian nationals in the affected area has reached the level that preventive evacuation before the events is operationally necessary. The same pattern before February 28th. The same pattern. Now the pattern has a documented next step. The heavy fighter jet activity over Iraq and over the Erbil area, where the United States maintains a significant military presence that was ongoing from the previous night, is the American military's equivalent behavioral signal. Aircraft do not fly at high operational tempo over Iraq in the middle of the night for training purposes. They fly at high operational tempo over Iraq in the middle of the night because the operational tempo is being driven by something that requires the full air architecture to be airborne and operational simultaneously in the airspace that connects the theatre's forward elements to the targets that the next phase of operations will address. High jet activity over Iraq at night. Russian evacuation flights from Somalia to the UAE. Iranian state TV teaching civilians to use AK-47s. The New York Times reporting Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 are being considered for a nuclear material recovery mission that could come as early as next week. All of these signals are pointing in the same direction on the same timeline, and that direction and that timeline are not ambiguous to anyone who has been tracking the operational indicators of this conflict since February 28th. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth welcomed the Gerald R. Ford back after what he described as the longest carrier deployment since Vietnam. The Ford was involved in the Maduro operation in Venezuela, then transited to the Middle East for operations against Iran, and has now been operating continuously for an extraordinary sustained deployment. The carrier that has been sustaining the combat load of the current conflict phase is being relieved by the carriers that have been in the theatre alongside it. The New York Times reports Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 are being considered for a nuclear material recovery mission that could come as early as next week. Now, let's get into Iran's new Hormuz control mechanism. Tehran has prepared a new mechanism to control traffic through the Strait of Hormuz via a designated route system. The IRGC is announcing it is about to formalize and operationalize the mechanism that every major power with interests in strait navigability has publicly rejected. The IRGC's announcement of a Hormuz toll mechanism is the institutional response of an organization that has decided defiance is its only remaining option. Iran's oil exports have been reduced by an estimated 80% since the start of the conflict. The rial has lost over 60% of its value. Inflation is running at over 40% annually. The difference between sanctions and a blockade is enforceability. Sanctions are paper barriers. A blockade is steel, water, and the willingness to shoot. The AK-47 instruction videos and the Hormuz toll announcement are the same response to the same pressure. The regime knows it is losing, and it is performing strength because it has no strength left to perform. The military track has added the ground option to the established air power and blockade options in a way that fundamentally changes the Iranian regime's survival calculus. The physical seizure of Iran's highly enriched uranium by Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 operators, supported by thousands of American troops holding a perimeter around the Isfahan nuclear site, cannot be narratively managed as anything other than what it is. The 440 kilograms at 60%, the material whose removal Iran acknowledged requires Chinese or American equipment, physically in American custody and no longer in Iran. The intelligence track has added the Monica Witt manhunt as the operational intelligence dimension that connects the historical damage of her betrayal to the current collection requirements of the mission she compromised capability against. The diplomatic track has the new Hormuz toll mechanism announcement as the IRGC's final act of defiance against the diplomatic consensus that the Beijing summit produced on the strait's status. The $400 million contract to Boeing for additional MOP production was announced quietly, but the operational implication is direct. The MOP is the only conventional weapon capable of penetrating Iran's hardened underground enrichment facilities. The air option and the ground option are not alternatives. They are components of the same operational design. Several hundred special operations forces have been in the Middle East since March, waiting for exactly this authorization. Iran's state television is teaching civilians to rack AK-47 bolts because the government knows something is coming that it cannot stop with the resources it has left. The Hormuz toll mechanism announcement is the IRGC's last assertion of sovereignty over a waterway it no longer militarily controls. Delta Force arrived in March. The New York Times says it could be next week. The AK-47 videos are on Iranian state TV. The pattern has a next step, and the next step is not a peace proposal. The question is not whether the ground option will be authorized. The question is whether the operators who have been waiting since March get the call this week or the week after, or whether the diplomatic track produces a last-minute transfer that makes the ground option unnecessary. The pieces are in place. The authorization is being reported as imminent. The regime is broadcasting weapons instruction. The Allies are evacuating their nationals. The intelligence community is hunting a defector. All of these signals converge on the same time frame. The next 72 hours to 2 weeks will determine whether the ground option remains a contingency or becomes a mission. And if it becomes a mission, the strategic landscape of the Middle East will not survive it in recognizable form.